guys for being here. We're going to get started. It's time. Welcome back. Hopefully there's going to be enough seating this week. I don't know, last week was a bit of an adventure with that, so we'll see. But thanks for coming. This is week 3. So last week we talked about this topic we call Earth Science but True. We walked through creation, we talked about some of the amazing things that God created. We talked about the vastness of the universe. We talked about the very complicated, tiny things inside us, and hopefully developed a sense of wonder about the amazing creativity that God displays in His creation. But we ended the last week talking also about some of the effects of sin on creation, and that God announced that He was going to send judgment. This week, we're going to begin discussing that judgment. We'll talk a lot about geology this week and some of the large physical evidence for Noah's flood. Next week, we're going to talk a lot about the evidence of that actual judgment, and we'll see all about paleontology. So keep that in mind. So this week we're going to talk not only about the geology, we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms of how the flood may have worked, and then basically uncover why our world looks like it does now. So, raise your hand, have you ever heard the story of Noah and the Ark? Oh good, okay, all right. This is probably what it looked like, right? I mean, honestly, I think sometimes I worry we do a little bit of a disservice by putting these things on our walls and such, because it really doesn't foster a sense of understanding what really went on. Sometimes, right? So, raise your hand if you've ever read the account of Noah's Ark. Okay, not bad. So, we're going to read about it now. I'm going to propose it probably looked a little bit more like this. Notice the large animals assembling themselves here. Several of you do have passages to read, and we're going to walk through this together. So if you guys have your Bibles, get them ready. We're going to read in Genesis 6 and 7 mostly. If you want a Bible, just put your hand up real quick, because I have a whole pile of them up here. Anybody else? Yeah? Everybody good? All right. So, who's starting us off? We have Genesis, well, hang on just a second, actually, let me start us off. So, Genesis 6, verses 11 and 12. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Okay, who is moving on from there?
And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy with them the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth, 50 cubits, and its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above, and set a door of the ark inside of it, in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which the breath of life, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your son, your wife, and your son's wife with you. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kind, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing on the ground according to its kind. 2 of every sort shall come in to you to keep them alive. Also, take with you every sort of food that is eaten, and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded.
All right, yes, he did all that God commanded him. Now, we're going to read these selections kind of the flood account now, and I want you to really pay attention to the details because we're going to talk about it in just a minute. But think through what's really going on for Noah and his family. Think through what's going on around them. Think through what God is telling them specifically as we continue. So who has 7, 11, and 12?
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heaven were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
All right, and who is 7:19 through 8:5?
They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground, and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were living in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. And on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of the area. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible.
Thank you. And then lastly, somebody has chapter 8, 13 through 19.
601st year, the 1st month, first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. They may swarm on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives with him, every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by families from the ark.
All right, thanks. So, pop quiz. How long did the flood last?
Days and 40 nights.
Oh, so close. Anybody else?
150 days.
Nice. Getting closer. Yeah, we don't really think about this, do we?
They're on 65 days, which is an entire year.
That is extremely close. So if we go back to what we just read, right, in chapter 7, verse 11, how old is Noah? This is extremely specific stuff, guys. This is like not something someone was writing a poem about, okay, right? The 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month. These are not fictional details, right? Who cares, right? Except now we know, because then we see as Noah gets off the ark, right? So it rains 40 days and 40 nights. The waters increase 150 days. There's another 150 days as they go back down. And then, in chapter 8, verse 13, Jacob just read, 601st year, this is Noah's life, the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried. And then it goes on and on. Several months pass as things start drying out. So the total, Eli was pretty close, 375 days, if you do the math, that they were in the ark. Okay? So I suppose it's probably slightly shorter than that because I asked how long the flood lasted, so my apology. But they were in the ark 375 days. Okay? So, could the flood have been a regional event according to text?
No.
I hear lots of people saying no. Okay, right, we just read this, right? Genesis 7, 19 and 20. All the mountains were covered to a depth of 15 cubits. It's about 23 feet, approximately, okay? So the mountains were underwater, the peaks of the mountains were underwater by 23 feet, they say, okay? So how would it be a regional event if the tops of the mountains were underwater? Wouldn't the water just continue to spill into the surrounding area, right? So we can't have a local event according to this text. And what did the text say died during the flood? Volunteers. Who wants to answer?
Everything that didn't swim for 375 days.
I think that's it.
Everything that breath. Everything, Tony says everything that can't swim for 375 days. I think that's very astute. So Genesis 7:23 says everything on land that breathed air. Okay? So yeah, I like that. Everything that couldn't swim for a year. Okay? So keep that in mind as we talk about things like, or as you're considering things like what was on the ark, right? I mean, obviously he didn't bring fish, right? Okay? But yeah, birds, creeping things, animals that walked on land. Okay? All right, so now we're going to keep this passage in mind. We're going to walk through what some science can then also show us was most likely happening during the flood. And then we're going to talk about some of the evidence that you can go see for yourself if you want. So, let's talk about the mechanisms of the Great Flood. All right? So, first, just remember with me, if you will, what the structure of the earth is like inside, okay? We've cut it in half here. We're splitting out the layers inside the earth. So we have a very thin part of the earth we call the crust. That's the part we live on. That's where all the oceans are. And then that's appropriately named crust because it's the thin outer covering. Most of the earth is this molten set of layers, the mantle, the outer core, and then the very core of the earth we are pretty sure is solid. Solid metal, we think. And we'll talk a little bit about how we know some of these things, but just remember this because it's going to play a role in what we're talking about here. So this is a map of the earth, and those red lines you see are outlining what we call tectonic plates. In case you didn't know, we all float on islands of rock on top of that molten lava. So we first started figuring this out. The very first person to notice that the continents were moving was a man named Alfred Wegener, and he figured this out in 1912. He called it continental drift, if you've heard that word. Okay, and then from there was a lot of advancements throughout the decades in mapping the ocean floor, checking the magnetism, marine geology, this kind of stuff. So by 1965, we finally have the acceptance of a theory of plate tectonics. So it's relatively young that we understand this, right? And then in 1986, Dr. John Baumgartner first proposed that the plate tectonics moving catastrophically were possibly a mechanism involved in the global flood. So once again, remember, we're gonna talk a lot about science, but the point is not necessarily to learn the science, but I want you to picture, as I'm describing this, and we're hearing PhD scientists describe this, picture the severity of what's going on, the devastation of what these things we're talking about would cause, okay? So the first event that we think probably occurred in the flood is the crust under the ocean started to what we call subduct, meaning move down below the continents. We really have no idea like what God did to start this process, but we know that as it starts to move into the mantle, this piece of crust here would get heavier and heavier. It's very cold compared to it, very dense. And so the further it sinks, the faster it would accelerate. Okay? Simultaneously then, the original continent we talked about last week, that God formed this one big continent, starts to break up. And this is kind of a cross-sectional diagram here, but you know, we see as it starts to pull apart, a fault forming, and ultimately then, as that area continues to spread, ocean water comes in and fills these newly forming rifts that we can kind of start to see here, you know, where some of our modern continent outlines are superimposed. So as this continues to pull apart then, the magma that's exposed from inside the earth is going to hit this water, and it's going to transfer huge amounts of heat into the water, right? And then subsequently that magma forms new rock, okay? As it does so, there's so much heat being released in this mechanism that there would be steam that would jet out of the ocean because it's so much energy. So this then contributes, we think, to what we call the windows of heaven, right? This being the fountains of the deep. This being the windows of heaven. Roughly, this is a modern storm, but anyway. So 40 days, 40 nights of torrential rain because of all this evaporation that's going on at the time. Just continuously blasting out into the atmosphere. Then as the process continues, we have massive earthquakes occurring. Continents are beginning to split. And then as they're separating, we talked about the acceleration as these plates get heavier and sink faster. And the continents move, we think, probably around a speed up to 5 miles an hour that these continents are pulling apart at. So then, as that continues, we have this cold crust again sinking in here, and then we create kind of a convection current, right? We have hot mantle material coming up here, where the new split is occurring, new fault here, new hot crust forming under the ocean here, but also the fact that the mantle is swirling like this also contributes, and the floor of the ocean essentially is relatively raised as compared to the continents. Continents somewhat sink down. And so this contributes significantly as well, we think, to the mechanism of the flood, as these progressive tsunami-like waves come and flood the continents. This may have been what it was like for them, pre-flood people. the waves get higher and higher. The high ground starts to become overwhelmed. But that's eventually, again, covering the whole continents and the mountains to a depth of 15 cubits. So these wave-like flooding of the continents, they come from different directions and they end up flowing and swirling over the surface of the continent, especially once it's fully covered, and they carry a lot of debris. They end up grinding off the surface of the continent and depositing thousands of feet of sediments carried from large distances. So we're going to listen to Dr. Steve Austin. He is a PhD geologist for about 1 minute as he describes this terrifying event.
On that granite, why does it appear to be such a stark line? I mean, it's clear. I think it's an erosional boundary of colossal scale. We're looking at something that shows the magnitude of flood flow over a surface. Granite was pulverized and converted to sand, and we see the rock above. That's the Tapete sandstone. The boundary, the two-dimensional boundary between the granite rock below and the Tapete sandstone above is this surface we call the Great Unconformity. And is it just here? The Great Unconformity is continent-wide. It may be intercontinental. I've seen it, I believe, in the Middle East. It's over in Europe. It's in Africa, and here it is under the North American continent. We see the core of the continent, the granite core, and then we see the stratified layered rock on top. It shows evidence of milling, of mechanical erosion, of pulverization of the grains at the boundary. At the boundary, and so it's it is flowing water with a vengeance, a fury of flow over this surface, ripped and pulverized the surface and created the sandstone overlying.
So the continents then are subjected to multiple inundation events covering the whole continent, and then they leave behind these huge sequences of sediment.
Is it granite on the bottom that you're seeing then, Josh?
Yeah, so that kind of purplish rock on the bottom is granite, and it's the core of the continent, so to speak. They were down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon in that video, and so that's, yeah, they were looking at the continental core, the volcanic rock, right, that comes from the mantle of the earth, which was then, he was saying, swept across by, you know, water and all the debris and such, and milled off, you know, nearly flat in general. And then those debris from that milling process is what creates the layers of sedimentary rock above. Now, one of the fascinating things he didn't mention in that clip, but is that the lowest layer there that they're looking at, that sandstone layer, has huge boulders suspended in it from where it had just deposited. Yeah, fascinating stuff. So then okay, there we go. So as the ocean crust dives further into the earth here, right? So this is a diagram simulating it, but you know, these crust fragments diving further into the earth, they actually get so far down that we see them impacting the core of the earth. They're continuous from under the ocean, under the US as an example, under the West, all the way down and hitting the core of the earth. And they call this spaghettification here, where they run into the core and get all mangled. So we talked a little bit earlier about plate tectonics, and when I mentioned Dr. Baumgartner in 1986 proposed this idea. By 1994 he created a supercomputer that was able to model what the interior of the Earth would look like if this was true. We had no way to know at the time, but now we have this field we call seismic tomography. And basically what that is, it uses earthquakes to image what is inside the Earth. And so we can map where these areas are. That's how we know things like the crust goes all the way to the core, because we can find it and map it with this field. And so by the late 1990s, early 2000s, that's when we really start to be able to map that. But we didn't have the computing power back then to be able to do like a full 3D map. But we can now, as of the 2020s, create a full 3D model of what's going on inside. Just for, because we live in North America, here's North America. This blue here is actually the edge of the Pacific Ocean plate as it's dove kind of shallowly, uniquely in North America under the continent, and then eventually nose down. So what we find today is that Dr. Baumgartner's predictions with his model back in the 80s and 90s is true. And not only that, but he almost exactly was able to predict where these plate remnants are underneath us. So in science, that means it's a good model. So I wonder here then, we know that he dived all the way down and hit the core here. This is just my conjecture, but I wonder if that's like what finally stops the flood mechanism, as like it, now we've got a continuous layer hitting the core. There's nowhere further for it to sink. Maybe that's what finally slows it down. I don't know. Leave that up to the geologists, I guess. So as we kind of get late into the flood mechanism here, this is kind of a diagram showing what I was talking about, is this ocean plate subducts under the continent then, especially out west. We uniquely have it kind of riding high underneath the continent. That raises up the elevation out west. I don't know if you've ever driven through Kansas, but you start out at like, 800 feet. And by the time you get across Colorado, you're at like 6,000 feet. Just this nice, slow, gradual increase. And then a lot of mountains out there pushed up from these plates subducting like this. The other thing that happens with this process is you get a lot of volcano activity. So again, if you go out west, you'll see lots of volcanoes along the Pacific Rim, but also other extinct volcanoes inland as well, like in northern Arizona. So this is how we get these big jagged mountains pushed up out of the ground, out of the water at this point in the flood. And this is in the Grand Tetons. So this leaves us today with this kind of surface, right? Now the crust is more stabilized, tectonic movement very slow by any comparison, and we have an ocean floor then which is significantly younger than the continents that we live on. This was something we noticed a while back before we really understood this. But the red here is the very youngest areas of the ocean floor where it's spread apart. And all of the ocean floor is younger than the continents. And so we learned from that essentially all of the ocean floor was turned over during this process. So now that the seafloor, new seafloor formation is essentially stopping, that seafloor begins to cool because it is new rock, but it is now transferring that heat again to the waters. And then as it cools, it becomes more dense. It allows it to start to sink back down. From that process, we begin to see the water running off the continents in sheets to start with. As you can imagine, if that was still fully submerged, the water's going to begin to run off as the oceans sink. And that leaves behind huge erosional features in these fresh sedimentary deposits. All right, so we read this summary in the Psalms, actually. He established the earth on its foundations. It will never be shaken. You covered it with the deep as if it were a garment. The water stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, the water fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. Mountains rose and valleys sank to the place you established for them. You set a boundary they cannot cross. They will never again cover the earth. So we went through a pretty extensive model of the global flood and some of the science that goes into that. And I'm very grateful that there are creation scientists out there who are studying this stuff with a mind to understanding how this would work. But time for some audience participation. So, if it were true, can you think of some things we might find? Anybody?
Fossilized sea creatures on mountaintops.
Fossilized sea creatures on mountaintops. I love it. That is specific. Anybody else? Any ideas?
Rocks or layers that they shouldn't be in.
Rocks in layers they shouldn't be in. Yes.
Lack of erosion in the stratification of sediment.
Nice. Yes. So what Jake's talking about, in between the layers of sediment, there should not be much erosion occurring because they're all being deposited quickly. Anybody else? Yeah, these are really good points, guys. Wonderful. So, let's talk about the evidence of the flood. Okay? So, firstly, we talked about this a little bit, but we should see, and we do, that the layers of sediment cover essentially the whole globe, right? This is actually the final layer we call the tejas, and this is the layer where the waters ran off the continents, but deposited these layers simultaneously all over the world. In addition, as Jacob so astutely pointed out, we should see these layers. And what happens is, as we get water running off the continents, we get these huge areas of erosion, right? I left this in here. I don't know if you can see, this is I-90 here. We're in South Dakota, town here, town here, town here, right? This is Badlands National Park. And it's a huge area of erosion. But what the erosion allows us to see is we get to see the layers. And so this is just piles of layers of volcanic ash and mud, essentially. And as you can see, the most distinct feature of this is these flat layers that extend all the way through. If you can imagine, under the part that's not eroded yet, these layers just continue. And then as it erodes more and more, we continue to see these layers that were continuous until they're washing away in modern times. But this isn't just something that we see in South Dakota. I mean, we see these flat layers everywhere. Everywhere. This is Goblin Valley in Utah. We see here a little bit of stratification of layers, which we'll talk about in a minute. Why are these rocks different than these rocks? But again, I want you to notice the flat layers all the way through. This is in Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, and we're descending down here this path to go down into this bowl that's washed out. But again, what do you see? You see big straight lines across, right?
Almost like the Grand Canyon when they're all gray.
It does look like the Grand Canyon, except they're gray. You're right. And so what's happening there. These are, again, mud and ash layers that are currently washing away, and as they do, we find these trees washed out of them. We'll talk more about that next week. But this is a fun one. This is part of Grand Staircase Escalante, which is a huge feature we're going to talk more about in a minute. But these are essentially erosional remnants. So everything else has been washed out. These are left behind, and you can even see there's different layers in the things that are left behind. But even better, look in the background, and what do you see here? Flat strata, right? So this is what was washed away that left these behind. But this is in Utah again. This is outside of, what's that one called? Probably out here. Oh, outside Capitol Reef. Fascinating layers of colors. I mean, this is literally blue. I don't know, I've never seen blue rocks before, but pretty cool. And I mean, even into Colorado, okay? This is the valleys in Mesa Verde, where the valleys have been washed out, and we can see again these flat layers. And what happens is the Pueblo people actually built in the layers. So where the layers were softer and washed out underneath, gave them overhangs. That's how they built their houses, is in the flat layers that were left behind. And just so you don't think that this only happens out west, this map here, if you see all these little circles, these are oil wells. And so from oil and gas drilling, we get core samples, which we can then compare, and some of our geologist friends put this data together, and they find that these layers are then continuous. So this yellow here is a particular sandstone layer, which we see in Michigan. This is the Pictured Rocks National Lake Shore. This sandstone is one continuous layer with the Tepete sandstone in Grand Canyon in Arizona.
Marcellus share is like that, shell is like that in PA and Ohio. When you drill, you're always looking for the Marcellus shell. So it's like that in our area as well.
Yeah.
To get down to
It is like that, yeah. She was talking about the Marcellus shale, if you didn't hear, but yeah, that's a big layer that we have out here that extends multiple states as well. Here's similar sandstones in Wisconsin. And then my favorite one for y'all, this is a road cut for I-77 north of Cambridge. And what do we see? Flat layers, okay? Flat layers of sedimentary deposit. So the next thing to know about these, so this is Cathedral Valley in Capitol Reef National Park. And you can see here where all the layers have been exposed by erosion, like huge amounts of erosion have just torn all this away. And we get these layers, but what we see if we get close to them is that these layers are stacked in a specific order. And they are coarse-grained to fine-grained, okay? So if you imagine what happens if you put some dirt in a glass of water, right? It eventually layers out at the bottom, coarse to fine. And what we have here, we have sandstone layers, limestone layers, or sandstone layers, shale layers, and then limestone layers, and it becomes coarse to fine. And then the sequence is repeated. Again, coarse to fine. Okay, and this is what we see all over the world. If you look at the background, you can even see some of the huge layers of erosion that are gone here. We're going to talk about that in a second. So, again, these things clearly been deposited underwater. This is an interesting one. This is This is not even in park. This is like outside Kodachrome Basin, Utah. But what we see here, we see a huge stack of mud layers. And what we have here, you see these vertical things in them? These are called injectites. And how those form, is that as the mud is laid down, it gets heavier and heavier, it squishes down, and the water that's trapped underneath forces its way out through in between them, because the water can't stay down there. And so as that forces its way to the surface, we get these features that form inside the layers. Once again, demonstrating that these were all wet at the same time, laid down together. And we get some really interesting stuff like this, where we had flat layers that were laid down, and then as that continental plate, or the ocean plate came under the continental, shoved everything up, rammed things together, made mountains, we get the layers of sediment that are folded in these crazy shapes. Okay? Now no one doubts that these were flat originally, before they were folded. But I will say that we've now studied this specific fold. This is in Carbon Canyon, just off the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and geologists have now studied this and found that this was all soft and wet when it was folded, not folded after it was rock. And that's significant because in the evolutionary time scale, this is approximately 500 million years that those layers were soft and wet. So beyond that, we get these huge erosional features, right? This is Canyonlands in Utah. This is, huge amounts of layers. We're standing up on top of them. Then that whole area is gone, or you can't see any of it in this picture. Further layers underneath just completely washed out. Huge erosion, right? And then this would again be as the water runs off the continent. And then it gets worse, further south as you go. This is in Monument Valley. And what you see here, originally there would have been layers of sediment above here. And then everything is washed away except for these little remnants that we call buttes that are quite massive actually. And we'll talk about a small erosional event here that Eli pointed out called the Grand Canyon. This is just a piece of the Grand Canyon actually. But in the Grand Canyon we have 10-mile span from rim to rim. And it extends for, somewhere between 100 and 300 miles long. But it's the volume of sediment that was washed out of the Grand Canyon is almost 1,000 cubic miles. But again, we see these layers here. Actually, down low, you guys see this kind of black and pink granite. This is the core of the continent where it was smoothed off, and we see these layers in units again. We see sandstone, limestone, sandstone, limestone. We see sandstone, limestone. We see shale in between them sometimes. But it's all coarse defined, several stacks of sediments that go through there. Actually, I don't know if you heard the video at the opening was talking about red wall limestone. That's this right here. Where he was talking about. But I think the Grand Canyon is a small erosional feature because then we have things like the Grand Staircase. This spans multiple states out west, and you can kind of there's no way to really see the whole thing in a picture, but this kind of gives you an idea what it's like, where you see these steps coming down, and they're all oriented towards where the water drains down towards the ocean. And so huge amounts of sediments, again, water running off the continents, carrying away huge amounts of sediment here. And the Grand Canyon is like this right here, right in this diagram. It's the little tiny feature. So it's over 100,000 cubic miles of sediment that is missing out there. So again, evidence that there was water covering the continent, huge flood. Even further, we see in some of these sandstone layers, we see these features we call cross-bedding. I don't know if you can kind of see the diagonal lines inside the flat layers. And then we see some here too. This is in Zion National Park. This here is in Walnut Canyon in Arizona near Flagstaff. But we see these crossbeds, and there's a PhD geologist by the name John Whitmore who has extensively studied these layers and found that the angle shows that these layers were laid down underwater, not in a dry dune. We attended a talk in Zion where they described to us how the sand that makes up these huge features here was carried there from the Appalachians. What to take away from today? I mean, hopefully you got the idea that this was a kind of a big deal, right? The part that gets me every time is that the continents being planed off. I mean, that's just devastation, like we couldn't believe. But Jesus says in Luke 17, he says, just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking and marrying and being given marriage, minding their own business, right? Until the day Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. So he's telling us it's going to be the same kind of situation when he comes back for judgment. And everybody's going to be just minding their own business, and he's going to show up. He also tells them in Luke 16, he says, if people do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Kind of funny, because then he did that. So next week we're gonna kind of wrap up real quick on that. We're gonna then dig into some of the evidence from paleontology that the flood was judgment. If you like dinosaurs, you should know. Next week is all about fossils. All right. Let me pray. We gotta go. Father, thanks for the chance to meet together to study your word, the events that you say happened in history, and then to see that the more we discover, the more we realize you already told us this stuff. Thanks. In Jesus' name, amen.